when Francis and I talked about the center and how it was going to be organized, we decided that one of the main pillars of the center should be the research. And to that end, we appointed Bradley Peterson to be the director of research. And he can't be here today because he's an examiner for the child psychiatrists for their board and had to be on the West Coast. The first person we considered for a research grant was Oliver Turnbull. I had met Oliver Turnbull some years ago when he first came to New York to lecture in the neuropsychoanalysis program and was very impressed by his detailed, clear presentation. And he told us that he had a project that had to do with intuition. He presented it to us, to Francis, myself, and Bradley Peterson, and we decided that he would be the recipient of this grant, which was not that easy to do because he is in Wales, and since 2001, transfer of funds between here and Europe has become a lot more complicated than it was before that. So, but we managed to do it. Oliver is on the faculty of the University of Wales. He's a neuroscientist. He has published extensively, and one of his books is available here. He helped us tremendously when Mark Soames and I were doing the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis. And then we decided that at one point he was really doing most of the work, and so he should become the editor. So for the past couple of years, he has been the editor of the journal, and he's also the secretary of the International Society for Neuropsychoanalysis. I think you can expect a very interesting presentation from him.
Good morning, everybody. If you page through the entire thing, you might hear what my talk is. So shall I put some sort of rule that you're not allowed to look beyond the first page? I don't know. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me here. Shall I wait until you all have a copy if you're interested? Okay, shall I get going? Right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for taking time for yourself out of your Saturday mornings to come and listen to some science on what is potentially, I think, quite a complicated topic. As you can see, today I'm going to talk about a really diverse range of things. Emotion, its relation to intuition, questions about problem solving and decision making, and the whole issue of imagination in relation to all of those things. I don't know what proportion of people who are here this morning were at the round table last night, but I was sitting in the audience, and I was increasingly relieved as the moments passed by about the extent to which people were foreshadowing themes which I'm going to be talking about today. It's always very cheerful to know that my take on imagination and science's take on imagination is in many respects overlapping with those of people who come from really a very different background. But the other cheerful part of last night's roundtable was the extent to which people would often say that they phenomenologically experienced a particular thing like intuition, but that they would dismiss it in saying, well, I have no idea, how it works. So one of my goals this morning is to try to explain to you what we know about how those sorts of phenomena work, and hopefully you'll take away a more complete understanding. In fact, I think for some people for whom the Cartesian dualism revolution isn't completely over yet, there's something mystical and uncertain about intuition, something that's perhaps not even entirely run by the body. And I'm hoping that there is much that I can convince you that it is entirely run by the body, but it's still interesting and mysterious. So hopefully we end up in that sort of position. So the general guide for the talk this morning is firstly to spend perhaps the first third of the talk building a sort of scaffolding of things that we can all agree on. I need to explain to you about emotion and its relation to intuition and problem solving and how we might empirically tackle questions of this sort. And I need that so that we all in the room agree about what I'm going to do during the second two-thirds. And I'm going to discuss partly the psychology of the phenomena, but also because I come from a neuroscience background and because neuroscience has a unique opportunity to try to tackle these problems. I'm going to speak about the biological basis, as far as we know, of these things. And then the final two-thirds of the talk are directed at the specific research topic that I'm going to talk about today, which is really about empathy. As Ed mentioned a few moments ago, we're funded by the Flockhorty Centre, for which we're enormously grateful. And there are three sort of grand projects which we're working on. And one of the three of them, the one for which we have the most data, is the empathy project, which is why I'm going to speak about empathy today. At some time in the future, I'd be delighted to come back and speak about schizotypy, or indeed some interesting findings that we have about education. But I'm focusing today in that latter two-thirds on empathy. It might not be something that people have thought too much about, and I hope our ideas are interesting for you. The findings certainly are to me, pretty striking. So I'll show you some experiments and discuss some of our ideas for future research. I'd certainly welcome people's impressions about interesting conditions that we could run and future directions. So I think also, I certainly can't start the talk without acknowledging two sources of enormous help. The first is from the centre, so we wouldn't be doing any of this stuff without them, and we're eternally grateful. Also, in modern science, although these are my ideas and this is my lab, and I'm the sort of the shop floor of this research. In all modern science, things are done by teams. The bulk of this work that I'm going to talk about, certainly in the latter third, has been carried out by Caroline Berman, who I wanted to show a picture of, but she refused to have anything where she wasn't wearing a hat. That's her climbing a mountain, Mount Snowdon, not far away from our department. And Catherine Evans and Richard Wolsey have also made a more modest but nevertheless some kind of a contribution. So I'm going to get going. I'm open to interruption if people feel that there's a point that needs further explication. If you'd like to stop me for any of those reasons, please feel free. I have no objection to taking a small tangent. Okay, so I think the right place to start, unquestionably, is with emotion, a topic which for the last century was disturbingly ignored by the mental sciences, with a pretty laudable exception of psychoanalysis. Mental science chose to study other interesting things during the last century, and there's nothing wrong with studying interesting things, but I would like to see a psychology that encompasses all of the mind. There are even some parts of mental science that chose to ignore or deny emotion during the last century. But the last 10 or 15 years have seen a sea change, a transformation in the extent to which psychology and related fields have become interested in emotion and indeed interested in the biological basis of the phenomenon. It's really transformed so many things. Indeed, it's given us an insight into aspects of psychology that we hadn't previously thought we would have access to, and I'm going to show you some of those examples this morning. I'm not especially interested in emotion per se. I mean, it's very nice that people should have it, and I know a fair amount about it. But I think the really interesting question is not emotion itself, but the relationship between emotion and cognition. To what extent and how do these relatively primitive feelings interact, shape, distort, modify some of the most intellectually sophisticated aspects of the mind? That seems to me is a far more interesting question, and that's the one that our research is primarily focused on. So this sort of emotion-cognition boundary is the one that I'm going to be speaking about mostly today. And it's thrown up a lot of unexpected findings, including the fact that I think 2,000 years' worth of philosophy has probably been proven to be wrong. We've had quite a long period of time in which philosophers from Plato all the way through Kant have told us that the correct way to make good, sensible decisions is to exclude emotion entirely from that process and to make rational decisions. And there are some circumstances in which, of course, the philosophers were correct. Emotion, especially if it's too influential in the decision-making process, can be an enormously distorting and destructive force. But we've been able to demonstrate, I think quite clearly in the last decade or so, that there are some circumstances in which emotion is very important for decision-making. Indeed, circumstances in which, without emotion playing a part in decision-making, terrible decisions are made. I find it quite refreshing that science should have been able to overturn ideas that have been floating around for so long. Especially, of course, if you're a fan of emotion, it's nice to know that it's winning back some ground, which it hasn't owned for quite a long period of time. So I'm going to begin by very briefly surveying the sort of giant literature that is the neurobiology of emotion, and try to gently lead us into what the connection might be between emotion and these high-order mental activities. If I'd given this talk about 20 or 30 years ago, I would have undoubtedly have spoken about emotion in terms of hemispheric asymmetry, the left versus the right side of the brain. And there were a whole series of findings, for example, during the 60s and 70s, which showed that the right cerebral hemisphere is more important for example, the ability to recognize emotion in faces, or the ability to produce or understand emotion in speech, that is, speech prosody. Those findings have not been overturned, but they've been much expanded by our growing awareness that the things that the outside new cortical parts of the brain do in relation to motion are cognitive in nature. They are the spatial transformations that allow us to see whether a face is happy or sad or disgusted. But that's not nearly the same thing as the visceral experience of being elated or profoundly depressed or overwhelmed with contamination in relation to disgust. Those are an entirely different matter and are run by much more primitive, phylogenetically ancient brain systems. Those are the ones that capture the sort of the reward and the reinforcement properties of emotion, the things that drive us motivationally to do things, that terrify us in relation to not wanting to go to places or to think of particular ideas. And that seems to me, maybe I'm just biased here, but that seems a much more interesting aspect of emotion than whether you can tell that a face is happy or sad or not. So the last couple of decades have shown us quite clearly that a series of ancient... Whoops. We didn't need that to happen. That a series of phylogenetically ancient brain systems seem to be involved in emotion, from the upper brainstem, which is the oldest bit, towards a range of subcortical nuclei like the amygdala, areas like the hypothalamus, and indeed the anterior cingulate gyrus, towards the medial parts of the frontal lobe. All of this sort of wide range of brain regions, roughly concordant with what we used to call the limbic system, although that's probably not accurate to describe emotion in exactly those terms. But these old brain systems seem to be centrally involved in this visceral aspect of emotional experience. It's also true that independent emotions seem to be run by different parts of this system. They're not entirely independent. There are some areas of overlap. But by and large, there seem to be a short list of core emotion systems in the brain. The magic number, as of today, is at least 4, I think. There are some people who might make claims for 5 or 6, and now's not the time for debating the minutiae of the topic. But effectively, and these are rather crude phrases to describe them, but they look like happiness, sadness, anger, and fear, the 4 core emotions. The literature has some difficulty describing each of them. In fact, happiness is enormously hard to specify in any great detail. There are at least half a dozen different ways of describing the way that emotion system operates. And happiness is a very broad umbrella term. I always think when I look at this list that it speaks to something of the human condition, that if we have 4 core emotions, that 3 of them are negative, it's not a very good prospect for humanity as a species. But on the other hand, if you're designing a machine, it perhaps is more evolutionary advantageous to have a number of brakes and only one accelerator. Otherwise, the machine ends up getting itself into all sorts of difficulties. So these findings were generated originally primarily in in animal species, particularly in other primate species. But there have been a recent spate of findings. The first and most famous of them really comes from Antonio Damasio's Iowa group, which have shown functional imaging of emotional experience in human beings. Early scanning investigations just asked people to look and see whether a face was happy or sad, or disgusted. And of course, as I said a few moments ago, that's not the right way to go. We need people to feel emotions. So the Damasio group were the first to find people who were able to close their eyes and imagine particular classes of emotion and events in their lives that made them viscerally feel sadness or happiness or fear, for example, and then put them in a scanner while they're doing this. I won't show you all of the findings, but this is the sadness condition. It's a subtraction version, like many functional imaging experiments, so it compares the sadness to a neutral version. The other emotions are more or less similar in their presentation. There are two big things that you need to know. The first of them is that there's enormous activation bilaterally in these phylogenetically old systems that I discussed earlier. So these, the visceral experience of emotion is run in human beings pretty much the same way it's run in macaque monkeys and probably in mice. There's a huge degree of phylogenetic overlap in these systems. It's not, of course, to say that human beings don't have extra things, new bolted-on sophisticated cognitive systems, but at the core of emotion, it's pretty much identical across mammalian species. On the other hand, there is either very little activation or, under some circumstances, even a decrease in activation in cortical areas when these visceral emotions are being experienced. In this sadness condition, these participants were in some cases crying in the scanner. I don't know that I could manage to generate emotion of that sort, but it seems to be that what's happening when they're experiencing these powerful emotions is that the cortex is more or less shutting down, while these old brain systems are enormously increased in their degree of activation. Really quite remarkable findings, giving us an insight into emotional experience that I can't imagine us having had a few decades ago. So you remember I said a few moments ago that I care about emotion, but I care more about the relationship between emotion and these high-order intellectual capabilities. And the mechanism for transfer of this sort seems to be happening in the medial parts of the brain, so that, broadly speaking, these areas that I've shaded in red, which run the ancient emotion systems, have an opportunity to feed forwards towards prefrontal cortex. In many cases, when you've seen people talk about prefrontal cortex, they show you the view of the outside of the brain and how cognitive resources, reading, writing, spelling systems, all project forwards to the front parts of the brain. But here's the sort of other side of the coin, in which these emotion systems also have an opportunity to make an input into what is the most intellectually sophisticated, the highest level of brain function. So quite remarkable, really, that the oldest bit still gets to have some input into the newest and most sophisticated parts. And the primary mechanism by which emotion seems to have input to these executive resources, as we call the things that prefrontal cortex runs, is partly, for example, through particularly complex sorts of learning, and especially through the planning of future actions. It looks like people run scenarios through in their minds of potential actions and then test out the emotional consequences of those ideas, and on this basis can select which ideas are good or not. It seems like a reasonable hypothesis. In fact, I think it's been around in psychoanalysis for the best part of a century. I think the psychoanalytic term is trial action. Testing out ideas and seeing what the likely outcome of them is going to be. Neuropsychology should have known, has known for 150 years, although we didn't advertise it very much, of what the consequences of damage to these systems might be. And some of you in the audience may be familiar with the famous case of Phineas Gage, that railroad worker in North America in the middle of the 1800s, who had a dreadful accident involving a tamping iron which passed up through his cheek and through the medial parts of his frontal lobe, effectively damaging just these brain systems that I described earlier, which are connecting the old emotional bits of the brain to the high-order intellectual parts. Not only did he survive, which is pretty remarkable in the 1850s considering the nature of the injury, I think it cauterized things as it wandered through, I'm not sure, was the change in him as an individual. There are three sort of common factors which can be described in the Phineas Gage case. And in fact, in 150 years since then, there have been hundreds of similar cases described. And the three common factors that I always take out of that literature is firstly the remarkable preservation of intellectual ability in these individuals. They seem very smart. They do very well on conventional tests of cognitive ability. Indeed, often, especially if they were bright before their accidents, they do very well on IQ tests, for example. But they make dreadful decisions. Real-world, complicated decisions seem enormously difficult for them. They lose money which they might have accrued, for example, money that they get from their compensation for their accidents, the modern cases. They lose their jobs typically. They lose the affection and love of their family and friends, and often lead to dreadful later lives. Gage, in fact, ended up, although he'd been a successful railway foreman, trusted by his employers before his accident, ended up in a sort of travelling circus exhibiting himself and his tamping iron, which doesn't seem like a very useful way of spending the rest of your career. The third aspect, which is probably related to the poor decision-making aspect, is that they're described typically as having had some form of personality change. They've become a different person after they've had their brain injury. I always find, for those of us who might want to believe that we have a particular self, a sort of soul that must be us and will be us forever, it's a little worrying that you could lose a few cubic centimeters of brain tissue and as a result become a different person, sort of own a different self. But that's Cartesian dualism for you. So remarkable patients, and it looks like what we are observing here is an impairment in the brain systems which are responsible for allowing emotion to have input into high-order intellectual capabilities and decision-making. So perhaps this capacity to think through the consequences of an action and then experience the emotion from that is impaired in these patients, and that seems most likely to be at the basis of their problems. Okay. So we're left then with thinking about just exactly how these many complexities might interact with each other. The literature has focused by and large on the role of these systems in decision-making and problem-solving. But there seemed to me, and I hope to demonstrate to you in the next couple of minutes, that there is lots of opportunity for considering the importance of these systems for all sorts of imaginative, creative, indeed intuitive phenomena, because it seems like the role of emotion in complex decision-making is experienced subjectively by us as intuition. It's that gut feeling or a hunch we have about what the right decision is to make, even though we somehow can't describe formally to anybody the reasons for making that particular choice. Now, I would be remiss if I stood up here and suggested that emotion is such a wonderful thing in our intellectual lives that we need to throw rationality out of the window and just trust our feelings in every decision that we make. I certainly wouldn't make a recommendation of that sort. It seems that rational, formal decision-making is enormously important, perhaps for many of the decisions which we make every day. But there are two circumstances, two sort of general overview situations in which it seems that emotion has a particularly important role to play in human decision-making. And by and large, I think I can summarize these as saying that they are circumstances of great complexity and great uncertainty. So by complexity, not an easy thing to boil down, but perhaps the best example is to consider how we might have to, under some circumstances, and I'll show you some examples later, track multiple objects in the world, and perhaps even the multiple interactions between those, if each of those objects were with the other. And by uncertainty, I mean the fact that although in some cowboy movies you only have good guys and bad guys who you can often distinguish merely by the color of their hats, in the world that we live in, people and indeed situations, but if you think about this, especially people, produce both good and bad consequences in multitude. So perhaps you might want to think about a family member or a work colleague or a relative that you know of. I don't doubt that you could conjure up one or two episodic experiences about that individual in which they've been especially charming or especially dreadful. But you're also able, I think, to get a sort of general experience of what they're like as a person. Is this a trustworthy, sensible individual, or is there something a bit shifty and unlikely about them? Probably that intuitive experience is achieved, it seems, by a sort of aggregate rolling together of every emotional experience you have had in relation to that person, so that you can somehow access the average, the sort of weighted average of all of your previous encounters with them. And of course you can use that to test out ideas. You can say, would this be the right person to invite to a dinner party? Would they say the wrong thing? Well, what about if that person were there? You can test that sort of idea out. Would they be someone you would trust to look after your children for a couple of hours? All sorts of potentially very important real-world problem-solving situations for which these resources turn out to be very useful. So I only wish that the neuroscientific community had been the first ones to access this, but actually it turns out that the cognitive psychologists have been beavering away on the problem of intuition for quite some time. This picture is Danny Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in economics of all things, although he's a psychologist, a couple of years ago, for his work with Amos Tversky that dates all the way back to the 1970s. The message which they told the economics community, and it took them a long time before they could convince them to give them the Nobel Prize for it, was that these rational decision makers that economists wanted to factor into their understanding of why people made economic choices didn't always seem to make as much sense as the economists wanted to believe. And they've demonstrated in a whole series of findings that human beings seem to use, irrational is the wrong word, but less rational than economists feel comfortable with methods for making their economic decisions. And they classified these two classes of problem solving as intuition versus reasoning, and described what they thought the formal properties of an intuition system would be. And their literature usually describes it as activities which human beings can occur, which can happen very quickly in a relatively automatic way, that it appears fairly effortless and quite fluid for us to be able to make these choices and have these feelings, that these decisions are somehow often laden with emotional valence. They're decisions which say to you a good or a bad thing about your choice, and also that they seem to occur by and large beyond introspection. It's a bit of a complicated question really about just exactly how far beyond introspection it is. I think there's a lot of variability, but that's not a bad take on this literature. So I'm going to try to give you really one example of imagination and creativity. There are many in relation to the sciences. Because I'm a workaday scientist, I often think of things in sort of scientific terms. And of course, science very often uses exactly these two sorts of systems in concert. There are numerous occasions in which scientists have a hunch or a gut feeling about which is the correct solution to the problem. Of course, you can't publish that in journals, and your colleagues, quite rightly, wouldn't want to accept that as adequate evidence. So having had the initial intuitive decision, you then spend many laborious hours working through the proof which may or may not prove what you or support what you otherwise have suggested. Yes?
Can I just backtrack for 1 second with a quick question?
Sure.
You talked about the way in which we might aggregate our impressions of a particular person to come to some sense of their trustworthiness. Is there any neuroscience work looking at that process?
I'm going to talk about something in a few minutes that I hope might answer that question. Just to pick an example off the top of my head, which I'm not going to talk about, there's some recent work on oxytocin, the sort of attachment, positive emotion makes you feel good related to the opioids drug, which people have been squirting up their noses recently in experiments. And if you give oxytocin to people, in playing a game in which it requires that you have various amounts of trust for the other individual. The people with oxytocin are much more trusting of the other than are the people who've had a placebo squirted up their nose. I think that's the finding. I don't know if David knows the paper better than me. But, I mean...
Doesn't the muscle have a patient who trusts...
That's a very other good point. There are too many good examples. So there are some neurological patients who have bilateral lesions to the amygdala. Someone in the audience will remind me of the term. David, do you remember? In 2 minutes' time, I'm going to shout out an exotic name to you, which is the name for the disorder. So these patients lack basically one particular brain region, especially associated with negative emotions like fear, and they're very charming, they're very trustworthy. People are forever taking them for granted by inviting them to do the sorts of things that you and I would think twice about, and they go along with those plans. So, and regretted, of course. They still seem to experience the negative consequences of their actions, but what they don't seem to be able to do very well is realize that the next time someone asks them to get involved in a dodgy real estate deal, that maybe it's not the right thing to do. I don't know if that quite answers your question. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so I particularly like Henri Poincaré's little quote on, he's the man who more or less founded chaos theory, I think 100 years in mathematics before everybody else did. Let me just read out the little quote that captures some of it. I listened last night, of course, to the round table, and it was nice to see that people offered scientists the opportunity to be imaginative and creative as well as the artistic community. So here's his quote. "What is mathematical creation?" he said. "It is not the making of new combinations." Because, he says in his quote, there are billions of new combinations. That's not very exciting. Anyone, he says, could do that. But to create consists in not making useless combinations. To invent is to choose. But the word, he says, is not perhaps wholly exact. That makes one think of a purchaser before whom are displayed a large number of apples, and who examines them one after another to make a choice. This, he says, is not the actual state of things. Rather, the sterile combinations do not even present themselves to the mind of the inventor. It is as if the inventor were an examiner for a second degree, who would only have to question the candidates who had passed the previous examination. So somehow his enormous experience, his expert knowledge in relation to mathematics, allows him to boil down, to throw away all the useless combinations and just think of the ones that are important. There's a literature, for example, in chess grandmasters showing similar sorts of things. They look at a board for a fraction of a second and they see all that there is to know about that situation and can very rapidly make a choice, much more rapidly than the rest of us. Of course, examples of the phenomenological experience of these things are very interesting, but for workaday scientists like me, we need ways of counting the beans. So we need a measure, a test of something which we can use to investigate, to use as our crucible, so that we can systematically measure this phenomenon. And the classic measure in this field is the Iowa gambling task, which in the literature is regarded as something which we use to measure emotion-based learning. That's the sort of fancy technical term for intuition, using emotion and your previous experience of emotion to make complex decisions. This work comes actually out of the Iowa group, the Mazio's Iowa group. The test itself was invented by Antoine Bechara in the early 1990s. And as befits a test which is somehow trying to capture complex real-world decisions, it's a test that allows you a lot of freedom, that has a great deal of complexity, and that also captures the uncertainty that I said earlier is central for the sort of thing which we're interested in. So people are offered an enormous amount of choice. They're faced with 4 decks of cards, and they can choose any card they want in any sequence. And they win or lose money based on those choices. In our lab, we pay hard cash because people seem to concentrate a little better under those circumstances. It turns out that 2 of the decks are what we might call good decks, and 2 of them are bad decks. But of course, that doesn't mean that you win money on the good decks and lose money on the bad decks. That would be far too simple for our purposes. Instead, there's a strong probabilistic relationship, so that with each card turn you can win money or lose money. In fact, there's some cards where you both win and lose money. But the contingency pattern, if I can use that term, for the decks is rather different. Two of them, which are the bad decks, have frequent, reasonably substantial gains on them, but also occasionally you incur even more substantial losses, so that if you carry on playing these bad decks, you will win money quite a lot of the time, but in the end you will lose money. You will be poorer by virtue of those choices. And the so-called good decks have more modest gains, but on the other hand they also have more modest losses, and if you carry on playing those decks, you will on average win money. If I could think of a sort of real-world example, the good decks are a little bit like paying your mortgage or paying into your pension. It's not exciting, but if you keep doing it for long enough, in the end you won't end up in poverty. So that's the sort of essence of the game. Of course, subjectively, people have no awareness of all of this complexity. They're moving around between decks in any direction that they would care to favor, being rewarded here and there, not understanding the way the game seems to work. But they do seem to learn, yes.
That's a question about that game. I mean, there are two factors. I mean, one is large gains and large losses versus modest gains and small losses. And then there's a different factor, which is the large gain, large losses weighted statistically to lose, and the modest gain, modest loss is weighted to win. And those are two different variables. I mean, you could have had frequent gains, substantial losses, but weighted to win, and modest gains, modest losses, and weighted to lose. So I'm just curious about what these people are going to learn.
It's true that you could have designed other sorts of contingencies, and I'm glossing over the fact that actually the two good decks are not the same and two bad decks aren't the same. They differ actually in the magnitude and the frequency of the losses in each of the cases. But on average, you will lose as much money on the bad ones, both of them, and it's true of the good ones. There's a modest literature trying out various sorts of combinations of gambling task, but this is the sort of classic version that people tend to use, and it's the one we used later, because what we're interested in, as you'll see in a few moments, is not the gambling task per se, but we want to give it a sort of empathy dimension, which I'll show you. But I agree with you, there's enormous complexity to the way these things could be designed. Okay, the original versions of the task used a manual approach of a deck of cards in front of people, but more recent versions have been computerized. So people sit in front of a computer, they see the 4 decks of cards in front of them, they have a little scroll bar which tells them how much money they're winning or losing. They see, when they make a choice, a sort of happy or a glum face on the screen which tells them whether they're losing or winning money. And as you'll see in some of the video clips a little bit later, they hear a sound which tells them the same sort of thing that the face tells them, which is whether they're doing well or not. So we try to give them as much feedback as possible about the choices of their actions. If you do things on computer, you can also collect, you have better time management for collecting other sorts of data, and the most interesting of those is probably skin conductance responses. I don't know if everyone in the room is familiar with SCRs or not, but in case there are any people who aren't, as you know, when we experience emotion, we sweat, small amounts of fluid, from all the pores of our body, and a skin conductance device, like a lie detector, measures the conduction between those two parts where the electrodes are, and you can measure very small changes in voltage, which are effectively the physiological correlate of the emotional experience. So when interesting things happen, like someone claps their hand behind you, or when you lose money on this task, people show changes in skin conductance. Okay, I'm going to speak mainly today about the behavioral consequences on this task rather than the skin conductance ones. And I need, before I show you a lot of complicated graphs in the last 2/3 of the talk, to tell you what the basic rules are. So this horizontal stripe you see in the middle of these Iowa gambling task graphs is a chance performance, choosing as much from the good decks as the bad decks. People tend to start out with a mild preference for the bad decks because you win larger amounts of money on them. So it seems like a good idea at the time, until, of course, they start to accrue the losses. And then they systematically start to drift towards better decks with time, until often they plateau between 60 and 100 trials in having a preference for things that tend to lose you to win you money. We've tried lots of variants of this task, and you have to take my word for it that it doesn't make much difference whether you use real or facsimile money. It doesn't make a lot of difference whether you use the manual or the computerized version. People tend to get better on the task as they gradually, although they're not consciously aware of how they're doing it, become acclimatized to which things are good or bad. There are some classes of neurological patient, though, who seem to lack this capability, and they are patients who have lesions to the ventromedial parts of the frontal lobe, especially if those lesions are pretty large and if they are bilateral. Here's normal performance of a group on the task, and down the bottom in green over here, you can see the performance of a group with ventromedial frontal lesions. They start, like everybody else, favoring the decks that seem like a good idea at the time because they have big rewards. But they seem to almost forget the fact that they accrue these punishments every now and again, and they aren't able to anticipate the negative consequences of the bad choices, and they remain losing money, which is presumably somehow related to the bad real-world decisions which the literature suggests they very frequently make. Okay, so that's the end of the first third, and I'll try to summarize everything before I dive into the science. I've been saying to you that emotion has this unexpectedly very important role to play in lots of aspects of mental life. It's important for some classes of learning, for problem solving. It might be experienced as intuition. I think it has an important role to play in imaginative problem solving and creativity and the like. And also, we think the best way of measuring it at the moment anyway is by virtue of this gambling task. So, yes.
How much do you attribute to heredity in the individuals, and how much to experience, environment, in terms of the emotion? Like some people might have more emotion than others. Some people might have, or is it based also on what one was born with?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very complicated question. Solve the nature-nurture problem in relation to emotion in a few seconds. There's quite a good literature suggesting that emotion, that your baseline setting of core emotion systems might well be inherited from your parents, but there's also, I think, quite good evidence that the extent to which the cortex learns to regulate, manage, and control those baseline systems has everything to do with your life experience. That would be my short summary of what potentially could be a very complicated question. I don't know if that's an answer, a good enough answer, but it's about as good as I think I can manage now. Okay, so a change of tack now. I'm going to speak about empathy here, which is the focus for the experiments that I'm going to be describing. So empathy is, of course, about your indirect experience of things, thinking yourself into the mind of another. It's especially, of course, associated with emotional experiences, although that doesn't have to be the case. There's a large literature out there on disorders of empathy in a range of patient populations. Autism and sociopathy are the two most commonly encountered, but there are a really wide range of DSM-4 diagnostic categories that list impairments of empathy somewhere in the list of the nature of it all. But I don't want to focus only on the negative aspects of empathy, because I also want to remind us, it's important for what I'm going to say in a few minutes, about the more positive aspects of empathy. It's, in many respects, the bedrock of our civilization. The capacity which we have to want to be good to other people underpins our ability to do everything, especially, for example, we're here in the middle of a very large city in which today we will meet people who we may never again meet in our entire lives, but we don't behave appallingly towards them. We often, indeed, go out of our way a little bit in order to enhance their lives, on the understanding, of course, that other people will go out of their way to enhance ours. This picture, by the way, is what happens when you go on Google and type in the word empathy. It is, I believe, called an empathy belly, and it allows people to experience what it feels like, I think, to be in the later stages of pregnancy if you wear it for a few hours or perhaps even for a few days. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the literature on the neuroscience of empathy. Not for very long, but partly to explain to you how the research that we've been doing differs from the sorts of strategy which the literature has currently been taking. There have been quite a few attempts by the neuroscientific community to tackle the empathy problem. And the one example I'm going to choose, which is not the mirror neuron one, although I could have done that as well, is to speak about recent findings for empathy for pain. The initial literature got people in PET scanners, for example, to look at the sorts of pictures that are likely to lead to pain in others, like catching your finger in a door or chopping a cucumber in a way that's likely to sever the end of your finger. More recent studies of this sort have been, to my mind, a little bit better controlled. Here's one that I actually was a subject in the scanner in our department, in which people are invited to experience two classes of physical sensation. The first of them is a painful one, which they achieve primarily by prodding your finger in an enthusiastic way with a toothpick. They try not to break the skin, but they certainly do inflict pain, I can assure you, with a force transducer, so that they know that they're going to make it sore, but not what's the right word? Ethically unacceptable. And as you can see, this particular brain region that I'm going to describe in a few seconds seems to be especially sensitive to feelings of pain, because you get a lot of activation in that brain area when you stick a toothpick into the end of somebody's finger. The control condition is when you apply the same amount of force to the same place in the body, but you do it with a Q-tip. And under these circumstances, this brain region doesn't seem to activate at all. So presumably, this is a brain region that's very interested in experiencing pain. Actually, I'll show you where it is in a few seconds, on another slide perhaps. It's the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is not a very phylogenetically old bit of the brain. It's a relatively new emotion-related brain area. So it's possible that this brain area may be involved in slightly more sophisticated psychological activity than merely the experience of pain. So here are the other two control conditions. This is activation when people are seeing somebody else experiencing pain. So you're watching somebody while they're having a toothpick forced into the end of their finger. And amazingly, there's about the same amount of activation as when you yourself are experiencing that pain. And what happens, of course, when you have a Q-tip, you observe a Q-tip being stuck into somebody else's finger, there's not nearly as much activation. So remarkably, it seems that a brain area that seems especially sensitive to the experience of pain, because of the nice control conditions, we can be reasonably sure that it's not just an artifact of watching somebody have an interaction with their finger, for example. Here's some of the brain areas, including anterior cingulate gyrus, that become activated in those conditions. Now,
You think it's irrelevant, the difference between the two Q-tips?
I don't think that came out statistically significant. If it did, it's interesting that you think that somebody else's Q-tip might be more dangerous than your own. But I think the main effect is between the pain and the toothpick and Q-tip, I think, is the main effect of the experiment. These are wonderful tasks, and I don't for a moment wish to disparage the people who are investigating them. But I also feel that they represent much simpler instances of what's interesting and useful about empathy than the sorts of phenomena that I want to investigate. Seeing whether somebody else is in pain or not is nice, but it doesn't come close to capturing what you and I in everyday experience describe in relation to empathic phenomena. And of course, in science, you can never capture the everyday phenomena without losing all control. But we can perhaps try to find a halfway house in which we were able to investigate slightly more complex aspects of empathy, which allow us to learn a little bit more about the phenomenon. So I'm interested in studying, of course, because I discussed these at the beginning of the talk, situations where empathy might be considered in relation to greater complexity. So when you have to think about multiple other individuals and the potential interaction between them. And also settings of greater uncertainty, where you can't be sure of what the outcome is. It's not a question of, toothpick versus Q-tip, pain versus no pain. Things where you're not really sure is going to happen in the future. So to give us an opportunity to think about these complexities and uncertainties. I'm going to talk about Casablanca for a few moments, which I think we can all agree is the greatest movie of all time. Any fans of Citizen Kane should probably not say anything for the next few minutes. Okay. It is, as you know, like all good stories, a bit of a love triangle. The main protagonist, who is, I think, a New Yorker, the Humphrey Bogart character, Rick Blaine, is living in German, well, almost German-occupied North Africa, running a bar. And while he is doing that, the woman who is ex-girlfriend doesn't seem the right phrase, the woman with whom he had a torrid affair earlier in Paris, appears in his bar, and they begin to rekindle something of their relationship. The problem, of course, is that she didn't tell him that she was married to Victor Laszlo, the prominent member of the anti-Nazi resistance. And this introduces, of course, certain complexities into the situation. The story, as you know, hangs on what happens because Rick comes into the possession of a series of exit visas which will allow two individuals to leave Casablanca with no questions asked, and the entire, more or less the entire cast of the story arrive on the airport outside Casablanca at the end of the film, when Rick is faced with a complex choice. He's holding two exit visas. Two people can escape from Casablanca. Which two people should he choose? So let's think through his decision for a couple of moments here. He can, of course, adopt an entirely egocentric perspective to the problem and think only about himself. Perhaps the right answer is, of course, for him to leave with Ilse, and they could spend a charming rest of their lives together. But of course, if he's a caring and sensitive individual, he might well think of Ilse's feelings, which would be very nice. And there are two scenarios here you might consider. How would Ilse feel were she to leave with Rick? Perhaps it would be very nice. Obviously, they're fallen in love again, except, of course, that she has to leave her husband behind in Casablanca. Or alternatively, how would Ilse feel about leaving with Victor Laszlo, which would be very nice for her. She gets to stay with her husband, but of course she leaves behind the man that she loves. What if Rick is feeling incredibly empathic? Might Victor Laszlo's emotional consequences be? He could leave with Ilse, which would presumably make him very happy, except, of course, for the fact that in leaving with Ilse, the reason that he's able to escape from Casablanca is that he was given 2 free tickets by his wife's ex-lover, which, once again, can't be a dreadfully enjoyable situation. Or alternatively, of course, how would Victor feel about being left behind in Casablanca while Rick leaves with Ilse? And if you've been working out the permutations and feeling creative, you can also consider the scenario in which Rick leaves with Victor Laszlo. I've seen a lot of Humphrey Bogart movies, and he would, I think, be quite useful in anti-Nazi resistance. This might be useful from Rick's perspective. We'd have to see. How would Victor Laszlo feel about leaving with Humphrey Bogart? But of course, that would mean leaving behind his wife. And how, of course, would Ilse feel about being left behind in Casablanca while Humphrey Bogart and her husband Victor Laszlo leave? So I think we all know, of course, the way the film ends, which is that Rick chooses to give the exit visas to Ilse and Victor, and they both leave, and he's left behind in Casablanca. So he's made what I think we can all agree is an enormously complicated choice, thinking about the emotional consequences for multiple other individuals, thinking about the uncertainties about the future, which must be very difficult to calculate. And at the end of the film, of course, Rick tells us why he was able to make this particular decision. Does he think about himself, or does he think about Ilse, or indeed about Victor Laszlo, the resistance fighter? He actually thinks about the big picture. He thinks about the fact that it's German-occupied North Africa in the early parts of the Second World War, and he considers the emotional consequences not for those individuals, but instead for a much larger group of humanity who may well, presumably, experience greater satisfaction in the longer run, were Victor Laszlo's work able to pan out successfully. So there are all sorts of scenarios in which other people's happiness might be increased by Rick making this choice. And as I think we all know, he says it very clearly at the end of the film. I wish I had a good New York accent to be able to deliver it in, but it's Ilse, it's no good being noble, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of 3 little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand that. So a situation, I'm not saying that all of life is like a Hollywood movie, but I think it shows us that very frequently in everyday life we're faced, we probably all could think of examples in our own lives, of scenarios in which we must make complex decisions, we need to think about multiple others, and consider the emotional consequences in relation to that. There also, of course, is a long history of psychoanalysis of considering scenarios in which young children have to establish whether other individuals are good or bad or not, especially, in fact, beginning in very early development, seeing the fact that parents can at times be good or bad in relation to those children, but children seem able to establish an overall aggregate understanding of the emotional consequences in relation to adults, and they seem to, from quite early ages, know which adults are reliable and trustworthy, and indeed which are not. I don't doubt that it's these systems that underpin those. The moments occasionally, of course, in development sometimes go awry. I don't know how clearly people can see this slide or not. It's one of my favorite Bart Simpson slides. It shows that even in children with difficult early childhoods, they're still capable of enormous amounts of creative thinking. I think this is a late 1999 subliminal mesagores, I think is the phrase, with Al Gore highlighted in dark green. Okay, I want to think, though, not about early development or indeed the Casablanca example, but instead to focus on another scenario, which is the domain of expert knowledge, because I think it offers some very interesting opportunities for us to study the whole question of empathy and how much we might learn under empathy-related situations. So I remind us all that we seem to spend enormous amounts of time asking our young people to go through formal education in schools, and then indeed university and all sorts of qualifications beyond those. But nevertheless, in almost every profession which you would care to think of, we require people, before they qualify as professionals, to sit with a previously qualified individual and act as some kind of intern or apprentice, so that they are able to learn the mechanics of the job. We think about these things, of course, sometimes in relation to medicine, but it's just as true of training to be a plumber or training to be a chef. I don't doubt all of us could think of examples in numerous professions in which some sort of apprenticeship or internship role is potentially very important. And it's worthwhile that we think of what people might be doing under these circumstances, which is different from book learning. And one thing which springs to mind as an obvious example is that you get to see the person you're training with make complex choices, often under situations of great uncertainty and complexity, and you get to experience the emotional consequences of those choices once you've seen what happens in that setting. So the experiments we've designed fit broadly within this expert knowledge domain. In particular, we're interested in circumstances of course, high complexity and uncertainty and emotion and learning and decision-making, and they are experiments of the general sort that I'm going to show you over here, which involve a particular individual making a choice and somebody else observing the entire decision-making process and presumably using empathy in order to acquire knowledge on that basis. We know that the Iowa gambling task is founded on the capacity of people to learn from complex emotional experiences. And here we have somebody sitting next to someone who is experiencing complex emotional experiences. If they're empathic, they should presumably be somehow experiencing what the person is living through. And it's an interesting scientific question, the extent to which the person B over there is able to learn. It's a sort of measure of how much empathy they're able to absorb. So in our version of the task, we've been using pairs of same-sex friends, and I'll show you a few video clips in a few moments. And they've been doing a computerized version of the gambling task, which is this red item, this computer over here. The two people I'm going to talk about are firstly the person I'm going to describe as the player, and I don't mean to overly labor this point, but the player makes the choices. They are the agent in making the decisions, and they are also the person who receives the financial rewards and who experiences the financial losses of those decisions. We have one constraint on the task that we offer to people, which is that the player is not allowed to make explicit verbal contact with the person who's next to them. We don't mind if they curse or move or do whatever it is that people do when they're winning or losing. You'll see some examples later. We just don't allow them to talk formally to each other about why they're making their choices. And the observer, at least in this stage of the task, is entirely passive. So they sit next to the person. It's a good friend of theirs. They've filled in a friendship questionnaire and the like, and they observe what's happening with their friend. So I'm going to show you my first of the examples. This is the least exciting of them, but I want you to get an impression of the way the general task works. And you're going to see a camera which is taking a picture of people playing the task. So you won't see the computer or the choice which they make, but you will hear this sound that I spoke about earlier. So when people get rewarded, they hear a very high beep-beep tone that shows that they're winning. In the next clip I show you, you'll see them getting a low beep-ba-ba-ba-bum tone, which happens when they lose money. And in this first clip, all I want you to absorb is the extent to which the players are the observer is concentrating, because of course everything I say in the next half an hour will be null and void if the observer is looking out the window. We need to be aware of the fact that the observer is concentrating on the task and seeing what happens to their friend. In the first clips, not much exciting happens because human beings seem to not be very demonstrative when they receive rewards. It seems that, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of negative emotions in human beings, and they're a lot more demonstrative in relation to, a lot more expressive in relation to losses. So here's our first clip. This is the pair experiencing a small reward. This person over here is the player. You'll see her making her choices with her hand over here, and that is the observer. I'll show you slightly more clips of these two individuals than some others because they're especially, well, they're quite entertaining, these two. They also seem to be rather empathic, and I noticed that particularly because they seem to be wearing matching clothing, even though they probably got dressed differently in the morning. So I'll just show you this. It's a series of reward trials. All I ask for you primarily is to concentrate on the player and is this woman who is the observer concentrating or not? Can you hear that? There's a reward of reward trials. She chooses. Her friend is clearly watching what she's doing. But it's not very exciting for them, getting rewards. I'm now going to show you some punishment trials. People show much greater emotional responses in relation to these punishments, and indeed at times they seem to interact. They look at each other. Sometimes, as you'll see later, they even touch each other. So here's a different pair getting punishment. So you'll hear the high tones for the reward, but you'll hear some punishment in a moment. I think it will help us, although it's not easy to do for you today, if you can try to observe the sequence of emotional interactions between the two individuals. Kind of who smiles first is potentially very interesting. So here we go again. Reward. Okay. So these two individuals, I'm going to show you the same slide again, just to show you the punishment trial that you saw there. She smiles a little bit, they seem a little bit bashful about this, and she almost looks a little bit towards her friend, and then you'll see them gradually settling back into getting some rewards, which seem to this pair of individuals and to everybody really a little bit less exciting. So there's the loss that you saw a few seconds ago. She looks at her friend, they giggle a little bit, and she's then going to go back to the rewards, which doesn't seem very interesting to her at all. Although her friend's still concentrating, which is nice. Come on, make a choice. Okay. Right. So now I'm going to show you a couple of more interesting punishment trials that both involve our participants over here. These people showed more empathic interaction than anybody else, and you'll see two of them with a couple of reward trials thrown in. It's really worthwhile concentrating on the faces of both these individuals, but especially the player in this task. Another reason I have her in there, of all of the people we tested, is that she has a very expressive face. If you have a look at her eyes, it's quite clear to her what's happening. Are you ready? was a small punishment. There's a bigger one coming now. Okay. So it's clear, it seems to me, that the emotional experience is shared somehow between these two individuals. Indeed, the observer reaches out and pats her friend on the shoulder to console her about her loss, which is interesting. It is, I think, even more interesting if you can store it at the back of your minds for something that I'm going to come back to in about 20 minutes' time when I speak about the data. Yes?
Just one question on that you may have empathy, but are there gradations? For instance, is there evaluation of the empathy? Like you have a Freudian concept of Schadenfreude, the enjoyment of other suffering, for instance. I mean, is it possible that you could have an empathic relation that then has some kind of to which there's another layer added to that? You know, the person says, yes, I see you are in pain, I can see it, but I'm not in pain. You know?
That's such a good question that in 20 minutes' time the word Schadenfreude will appear on a part of the screen in relation to some of the data we have. So that's a very good observation. But it certainly seems clear to me that formally these two this observer seems to be consoling her friend in the sort of way that looks like a very public demonstration of their trust. But I'll show you a clip in a few seconds that might speak to the Schadenfreude issue. So here is another item. I'm going to ask you to concentrate even more on this one than the other one, although I showed it to you twice. Two things happen. Well, there are 4 trials in this video. I don't care about the middle 2. The first one is a pretty substantial loss, and you need to look at the emotional expression on the player's face and try, if you can, in time, to watch the expression on the observer's face, and then they have this sort of big interaction at the beginning of the clip. And then there are 3 reward trials. The middle 2 of them I don't care very much about, but I'm especially interested in what happens to the player's face on the 3rd reward trial. And I'll talk about both those things in a few moments. But you'll see the clip twice, but if you can concentrate the first time, it'll make my bit in between more interesting. Are you ready?
Yeah.
First reward. Second reward. Now look at the player over here. Okay, so that last little moment there was an anticipation of punishment. She chose a deck which actually, as you heard, rewarded her, but it was one of those bad decks which has a higher risk of punishment, and she was able to experience that anticipatory trial action, thinking, I could lose money on this, and she physically withdraws herself from the dangerous computer that somehow would be attacking her were she to make that choice. And you can see that at the beginning, that wonderful little moment in which there's a reason why the player slaps her friend. So let's have another little look at that clip. So you'll see this interaction. Try to follow the sequence of what happened, or who experiences which emotion where at the beginning, and you can enjoy the anticipatory emotion at the end. Here we go again. Here's the anticipation. Not experienced, of course, by the observer. She knows that she's she's doing something risky, but her friend is more or less oblivious to this. Okay, so that's the first thing that people do, and the data that we collect, which is the behavioral response of these people. Which decks do they choose or not? But there are lots of other kinds of data which we can collect. The first of them, and I won't show you any data until very late in the talk, is the skin conductance response, which we've collected sometimes from the player, but also at times from the observer. And the third class is what we call subjective experience ratings. People being asked every 20 trials to rate how good and bad each of these decks are. People never achieve very much formal awareness of the game. That is, people can't describe to you, how the game works, but they start to develop this sort of gut feeling that some things are nicer than others. And if you ask them numerically to sort of give you on a scale of 1 to 10 how good they are, they seem to show reasonable amounts of awareness. And we also collect emotional expression data, which is exactly what you've just seen, which means, of course, that we've got an absolute mountain of this stuff. I'm not looking forward to the prospect of coding all of those seconds of interaction as we look at how people interact. Okay, so that's the 4 kinds of data that we collect. I'm sorry to make things look a little more complicated, but what I've showed you so far is only what we might call phase 1 of the task. That is when the player plays the game and the observer looks at what's going on. But I'm not, of course, interested all that much in just the question of how much empathic experience happens during this phase. I'm interested in the learning aspect. We want to know the second time, if we eject the player from the room and ask the observer to play the game, how much have they learnt? After all, this is an emotion learning task. If you're empathic, you should be learning something from your friend who's right next to you. So that's the data that we're going to show you now. So this is the people thrown out of the room. The player has been ejected, and this is the woman who was before the observer. She's now playing the game herself. I won't show you too many of these clips because they're less exciting. People show much less emotional expression when there's nobody else in the room. But this woman is somewhat expressive, and you'll see her on a punishment trial here. If you have to sort of look at the center of her face to be able to experience anything. She's clearly felt some degree of loss, but it's just she's sort of crumpled up the middle of her face in a feeling of disgust or loss, for example. So less powerful. So I would love to show you the empathy data that I just talked to you a few seconds ago about, but you will understand the empathy data much more clearly if I first show you one of our control conditions, which is a baseline condition which allows us to see what happens to normal people when the same person plays the task twice. Otherwise, we won't be able to measure the magnitude of empathy, if that's the correct phrase. So in order to control for fatigue and practice effects and so on, here's a player playing the task and then the same person having a second go. I won't show you the video clips. There's not very much to learn from that, but I will show you now what the data look like. So I'm going to show you a lot of these graphs, and I'll spend 20 seconds explaining to you what happens when I put all these things on the screen. On the left-hand side of the screen over here, we have phase 1 of the task. What happens when people, have a go the first time. And as you can see, it looks pretty normal. People start below chance, and they learn and plateau after 60 to 100 trials. Down the bottom over here, I have all 100 trials averaged together. So when you average the mild loss here and all of these modest wins, you get an aggregate score which is substantially above chance. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see what happened to people when they played the task the second time. There was a modest loss in performance, perhaps because we thought that we changed the contingencies, which actually we hadn't, on the task. But people learn. They learn about as rapidly, but from a lower baseline, so that they show much better performance on phase 2 of the task, unsurprisingly really, than they do on phase 1. And this little bar chart that you see at the bottom over here shows us how much the aggregate performance is for phase 2, which of course is much larger than it was for phase 1. And if you want to keep track of this little graph on the right-hand side over here is the difference between phase 1 and phase 2, which of course one would always expect to be positive, because people are learning between phase 1 and phase 2. There should be some that sort of measures the size of the advantage between the two phases. So that's the first finding. It's not too shocking, of course. People learn on the task. The second time people do things, they get better. Here are the subjective awareness data. So this is the ratings from people about how much they like individual decks, which are worked out together. And as you can see, people start a little below chance, and they show pretty standard finding this enormous amounts of learning. They're aware somehow. They don't know how the task formally works, but they're aware of good and bad performance. In phase 2, they start out knowing more than they did the first time because, of course, they have the previous experience, and they continue to grow in their awareness. They don't reach anything like ceiling. The task is too complicated, I think, for people to fully and transparently know what the solutions are, but it's enough for them to know the basic way the task works. Okay, so the big finding, of course, we're all interested in is what happens under the empathy condition. But before we do that, I think we need to have a sort of thought experiment about what we would anticipate these findings to be. How much does the observer gain from watching the player during phase 1? And there are, we might imagine, 2 obvious scenarios here. Option 1 is that there is a 100% empathic experience between A and B. Being the observer is like being in the skin of the player, and you experience everything emotionally that they do. And as a result, when you play the game for the second time, one would imagine that the observer's performance in phase 2 would be exactly like the person playing the game twice during phase 2. I think if that's clear to everyone, I don't want to mention too many contingencies here. Shall I say that again, or? Yes?
The question is?
Well, I want everyone to be clear about what we're expecting. So if there's 100% empathy, we expect performance in phase 2 of B to be as good as phase 2 for the person we saw a little bit earlier. That is, they should start better than the first phase and learn even more. There's another scenario, of course, which is what we might call the 0% empathy experience. It's very nice to be sitting next to somebody, but even though you sit next to them, you don't seem to learn very much on the basis of this emotional experience. How well are we expecting people to do then during phase 2? And the answer is that they should be like a novice. They should be just as good as a player during phase 1, or indeed just as good as the player they observed during phase 1.
Very good, in other words, 100%, even without it. They've just been watching the contingencies. They haven't been monitoring the emotional reactions of the player.
Well, you might argue, but the task doesn't become formally conscious to people in quite that way. And when you see some of the data, it might help you a little bit to understand. Come back to me if you think that's still true in 5 minutes' time, is what I'm thinking of. Yes? Oh, okay. All right. I mean, it is true that if somebody formally understood the nature of the game, they could...
So are you saying that in this game it's a bit more complicated than the classic Bashara task, where people do seem to arrive at a fairly conscious evaluation of the...
Well, it's the original Bashara claim was that a very modest number of people reach conscious awareness by 50 trials. A large proportion do by 100, but actually the claim in the original papers are that there's no advantage to full subjective awareness.
True enough, because the frontal patients also have that degree of subjective awareness, but it doesn't translate.
Exactly. So, but I'm hoping that the data on the next slide or two will mean that problem isn't quite the same problem that you think it is now. Okay, so the question, yes.
Is there any importance of the delay between the 2 experiences?
Well, we haven't controlled for it at all.
I just asked that because of the problems of memory consolidation. I don't know if you're aware of the consolidation and destabilization and reconsolidation. And I asked myself if there is an advantage or disadvantage with the traumatic experience of the failure. If you see something you felt during the experience, either destabilization of the memory trace, then either delay, which is available to reconsolidation or not.
Well, I think it might be a factor, but I'm hoping that the control condition I just showed you here, in which the amount of delay, which is more or less a couple of minutes as the player is ejected from the room, is the same in this condition as it is in that. And I'm going to show you a third condition in about 5 minutes' time, which also has the same amount of delay. And the effects seem quite different, even though the delay is the same under all those circumstances. We have done a couple of experiments which have longer delays on the IGT, 1 week in patients who are amnesic. And they show similar sorts of gains to the gains that this player is showing over here with a delay of a few seconds. So, okay, so is it a 0% or a 100% empathy experience is the short answer. And here are the data. Let's focus on phase 1 first. This is how the player does, of course. Not very interesting for us, but we'd like to know that we'd brought players into the lab who could do the task. So they perform below chance and they get better across time. And this shows a substantial advantage when you average this out over the first 100 trials. But this is the finding that kept us awake at night. As you can see, the player playing the task the second time shows a disturbing, almost incomplete failure to experience any advantage from their initial empathic exposure on the task. And indeed, their performance is worse than somebody who is a complete novice at the task. So, sorry, the observer. So this observer, this is B the second time round, is worse than someone who's never seen this task before, which worried us enormously. We were expecting all these advantages that would accrue from empathy, and well, apparently on this particular task there seemed to be. Sorry, you have a question.
I think that makes sense because they're empathic to the reaction of the person, not necessarily the task at hand. So that's almost serves as a distractor to be aware of the reaction of the person.
Well, it may be a distractor, but if it completely distracted them, as I'll say in a few moments, then we would expect them to be more like a novice the second time round. Not worse. I mean, it's as you can see, we're in a situation over here in which the average performance is worse than chance. It's as if there's a sort of a giant decrement in performance. Yes?
That's why the empathy for the person and the empathy for the person's reaction, which is more than their duty as opposed to text.
But the empathy for the person should teach you about the task because they're learning about the task, I would have thought. But the person's reaction should be congruent with the task. When you win money, it makes you happy. When you lose money, it should make you sad. Presumably. Sorry, did I miss something? Or?
I mean, I just think that if you're attuned to a person's reaction, you're more sort of interactive with that person's reaction as opposed to a task that that person is engaged in. So that they're more attuned to what that person is feeling as opposed to what that person is engaged in.
That's possible. But can I consider another little scenario here, which is viewed from the perspective of the player. This player over here has their best friend sitting next to them. And that doesn't seem to be impeding their performance at all, even though they must presumably be feeling empathic about their friend while they're playing the task. They interact in that sort of way, and it doesn't seem to make them any worse. So, I mean, I'm not saying it can't be true, but I'm not sure that having somebody else in the room necessarily is a problem. Whoa, this room is just lit up.
I'm wondering if what you say really doesn't go back to your initial distinction between emotion and cognition. That, in a very simple sense, the emotion is getting in the way of the cognition. I mean, it's one way to read that. And so the cognitive aspect of the task is diminished by virtue of the fact that there's kind of distraction.
It's an interesting idea. The problem, of course, is that the task is supposed to be about emotion-based learning. So, but that's, I would be a fool if I said there wasn't potentially a cognitive component to it. Yes,
The friend replaces the friend. The observer replaces their friend.
Yes, effectively.
So, I mean, maybe that's why they do poorly.
Oh.
Yeah, guilt. Our favorite motion.
Well,
I want to see what's next.
I'll show you a control. In a few moments' time, I'll show you a control condition, which speaks to the question of whether replacing your friend makes you worse. So that would perhaps answer the guilt question. Sorry, there's so many questions out here. So yes.
Well, the problem may be that the friend now is alone. Where's the observer for the friend? For the friend?
She's the observer's out the room.
She's out the room, right? So that's maybe why the reason why there's less learning.
I tell you what. Why don't you wait until you see my next control condition, and then you can test the hypothesis out. Sorry.
But when you expect an improvement, you interpret on the rewards, but the result is an interpretation, positive interpretation of the condition. I think if you see something being wrong with something, if you punish if the other punish your friend, you will be less motivated to do the test after.
But surely that should be teaching you. Someone's just done, your friends just stuck their hand in a fire. They've just found it very painful. So presumably you don't put your hand in the fire. That's what modeling and learning is all about. Learning from the pain, from the experiences of others.
Teaching is about the condition, but the emotion is the emotion. What you learn with emotion is to be conditioned, to be rewarded. And what you learn with cognition is to teach something. to feel for the other is emotional.
Yeah, but can't you learn from other people's emotions? I mean, that's what empathy is all about.
In your test is learning the emotion of the other and not learning what to do.
But you have, well...
Can I ask you what happens if you've done exactly as you've done, but during the observer phase, the observer sees their friend making choices, hears the feedback, but cannot observe their friend's emotional reaction?
Nice control condition. If you wait for 6 or 7 minutes, we'll be there. But thank you very much for coming up with that good idea.
All right.
Okay. Shall we carry on? Yes. Okay. Subjective awareness of these individuals. We need to know how much people know during this task about other individuals. Sorry, it's a bit cluttered on the left-hand side of this task because there's a lot of potential for subjective awareness. And these are some of the data that I have the most difficulty of all the stuff we've generated, but data is data. In blue over here, you see the subjective awareness of the player. No surprise there. Performance starts low, gets better with time. The two purple lines, which are so similar, are similar because we asked the same person two similar questions. Those are the performances of the observer. In the one case, we asked them to rate which decks they thought were good and bad. And because it was an empathy task, we thought we'd also ask them how they thought their friend was experiencing, which decks they thought their friend was experiencing as good or bad. And given, of course, that unless the observer has psychic powers, their own experiences are likely to cloud what they think somebody else is experiencing, they look pretty similar. But the disturbing thing for me is that they're rather good. Their performances, subjective awarenesses during phase 1 of the observer are well above chance. In fact, not very different from the player. Even though the second time this person has a go at the task, they seem to be incredibly poor behaviorally. And during phase 2, although the subjective awareness scores are not spectacular, they are substantially better than the actual behavioral performances. So somehow, in a way that I don't feel completely able to understand, they seem to know what the right choices are to make, but don't mechanically produce those in relation to the task. So really quite worrying findings if we're trying to explain the bizarreness of the phenomenon. Okay, so here we go. If you were interested in designing a control condition, you might wonder whether some of these phenomena might have been produced by the presence of your friend in the room in a way that interferes with the task in a number of ways. So what we wanted to do was put the friend in the room, but make sure they didn't actually see their friend perform the mechanics of the task. So they couldn't see which choices are good or bad. But they see the emotions on their friend's face as they carry out the task. They hear all the sounds of winning and losing that fill the room when they're playing the task. So we've done nothing more than remove the one component, which is the potential for learning from the situation. So, and this speaks, of course, to some of these questions earlier about how guilt when you step into your friend's place and so on. Effectively the same task, except that B is moving from a slightly different bit of the room. And here's the behavioral performance of the players during the first phase, and they start below chance and they learn like everybody always does on this task, and that's the average performance over there. And interestingly, here's the performance of the observer who stands in the place of their friend during phase 2, and they show pretty normal learning. In fact, if anything, slightly better learning than the player on the first version of the task, worryingly suggesting that these people have actually learned something somehow, heaven only knows what it is, perhaps acclimatizing to the general situation or something of that sort, but clearly an entirely different form of performance which is occurring during phase 2, even though so much of the setting seems to be identical under those circumstances. And the subjective awareness data, of course, follow the behavioral, so people start and get better during phase 1, and during phase 2, the observer starts bad and perhaps learns slightly more rapidly than the player. So let me see if I can briefly summarize the data that I've showed you now. These are people, this is just phase 1 for all 3 of those groups. In phase 1, whether you are a player who is being observed or being blindly observed, if that's the correct phrase, or if you're playing on your own, people show learning on this task. in a pretty reliable and consistent manner. No big surprise there. There's only one group, however, who do badly during phase 2, and those are the individuals who have previously been observing somebody else in the most, what you would think would be the most informative form of observation that you can have. And they do, of course, perform marginally above chance, but certainly significantly worse than all of the other conditions. I'll just spend a few seconds, I don't want to get bogged down in these data, showing you the skin conductance findings, part of which I wish I could explain better. People seem to show slightly higher skin conductance responses during phase 2 than phase 1, and that seems to be true across all 3 groups. Can't really explain that one very well. I could have a few hypotheses. More easy to understand is the fact that the skin conductance findings for the 2 groups who are in a room with somebody else are much higher than they are for the person playing the game on their own. Presumably there's something more emotionally arousing about being next to your friend rather than being on your own. And this is true, by the way, not only for anticipatory skin conductances, but also on reward and punishment trials. The skin conductance findings are pretty consistent. So let's just try to summarize some of these ideas in our mind. Emotion, of course, seems to be very important for this whole wide range of interesting phenomena. And we've been trying to measure the indirect experience of these issues. The observer, I hope we can all agree, seems to be concentrating in this task. They seem to be experiencing the emotions of the others somehow. They're interacting, certainly, with their friend. They seem even, dare I say it, to be having a subjective awareness of emotional experience in relation to the task. But they're, of course, doing very badly, very, very badly. So what is this inhibitory factor that is making people worse? I've got 3 ideas, one of which can't be true. But before I say that, I have to remind us of how surprising this is. I don't want to be the person out here saying that as a society we should give up apprenticeship and internship on the argument that it seems to apparently make learning worse. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence out there that there's some advantage to it all, and I don't want to be treated by a physician who's never been an intern, or have my plumbing fixed by a plumber who's never been interned to another plumber. So clearly there's something about the way we've designed the task which is not consistent with the conventional versions of what the apprentice or internship relationship is like. And of course, one interesting idea for our future work is to titrate back in several variables and see which one magically improves performance again. So our suggestions, for example, actually maybe I should take Francis' question, was that?
No.
Okay. Should we now allow these people some form of more verbal instruction to their player? Can let the player tell the observer why they're making their choices in the words of the English language, and see if that improves their performance in a way that doesn't necessarily occur when they're not allowed verbal performance. We might also try players who are more experienced. After all, our player is as naive as our observer at the beginning, and your intern is not as naive, or is far less naive than the person who they're being interned with. So that's one, I think, potentially interesting scenario. So what are the explanations? I've come up with what I think are a couple of entertaining ideas here, but I'd be delighted to hear if anyone else has any suggestions that don't belong to, that don't fit into this class. So the first one, which I think was suggested a bit earlier by several people, is that the reason for the poor performance of the observer is because they have some degree of incomplete empathy. Maybe their empathy is less than 100%, or maybe there's some kind of divided attention that happens by virtue of this. And it would be a good argument if they just showed performance like a novice, but I don't think it completely explains why they show these subnormal performances. It's not, as an explanatory account, it doesn't quite do it for me. There are 2 explanatory accounts that I think might tackle it. The first of them is the capacity of the 2 individuals, not so much to generate theories, but to test them. So the player is in a situation of experiencing some emotional responses, and then saying, okay, I'm going to try out a hypothesis. Will I get punished if I do this? And the player makes the choice. The observer never gets to properly test their hypotheses out. And it may be, because human beings are always fond of thinking that they know what the answers are to things, that the observer is believing the inadequate hypothesis that they're starting to develop about how the game really works, because they never test it. And then when they're faced with the game itself, they have to unlearn, which human beings are notoriously poor at, an ineffective strategy. Yes?
Could it also be that the impact of negative emotions is more resonant with the observer?
That's interesting. But if that were true, I would have thought that they would be better, because they would say, oh my gosh, you chose that and it really hurt. I'm not going near there again.
It then decreases the accuracy.
I think it might make them less accurate, but it's hard for me to see how it would make them worse than the naivety. It's possible, I suppose.
It interferes then with some kind of cognitive function.
It might well. I'm not quite sure how to think that one through. Sorry,
Well, your theory, your concluding theory, fits with the nature of apprenticeship. Apprentices do not stand by and watch. That's not the nature of any of these training programs. But have to then go through that full cycle that you're saying of trying to then do it themselves and see if they've assimilated the. So that would certainly, that's more the apprentice model than the experimental setup.
It certainly would be interesting if what happens in the see one, do one, teach one world of surgical apprenticeship, say, is that you watch one, and then if we had the player perhaps sitting in next to the observer when the observer goes and giving them a little bit of guidance to improve things, that may well be very interesting. It's a scenario we could certainly consider. Yes.
What about being too smart for one's own good? That you really try to outdo the original participant and try to do everything differently, and the task is such that you can't. You fail.
I think it probably falls into, as you say, this general class of the observer coming up with an answer that's, as you say, superior, and then of course it turns out when they're confronted with hard reality that that their theory doesn't really work. So yes, I think that's interesting. Are there any other questions, or shall I go on to my last theory? Okay. As Francis correctly predicted, Schadenfreude. I think of all of the possible accounts, this is the one that seems to make the most sense to me. And I think we have to spend 1 minute thinking ourselves into the minds of these two individuals. When a punishment happens, when money is lost, the player, of course, doesn't enjoy this, and this is experienced very negatively. On the other hand, the observer is in a situation in which, although formally it might be very socially appropriate for them to console their friend for their loss, if they are experiencing any pleasure in the other person's pain, then we have the interesting scenario in which player A is experiencing a negative emotion, but player B is somehow labeling that object as positive. And that, of course, is going to throw this entire task into disarray, because if you can't learn which things are good or bad, then it undercuts the entire nature of the task. So the question really is how to try to tackle that problem. Not desperately easy to do. Some of the possibilities that we've considered for future research are, for example, to decouple the decision-making choice aspect from the reward-punishment-receipt aspect. So what happens when the player who makes the choices is not the person who experiences the emotional consequences? That would perk up the emotional interest of the observer a little bit more if they were on the receiving end of these decisions, which I think might be interesting. We haven't been able yet to investigate intimacy of acquaintance, but there might be some very interesting interpersonal questions that we could ask of the relationship between these two individuals to see whether that somehow predicts things. Of course, it's very hard to put a questionnaire in front of somebody in which you ask them whether you sometimes really enjoy it when your best friend has something bad happen to them. So I imagine that it'll be difficult for us to formally investigate this somehow. One interesting possibility might be to look at skin conductance findings in relation to these. So we know, for example, that people show larger SCRs when they're punished than when they're rewarded. If the observer is experiencing pretty modest skin conductance response changes when the player is losing, it might well suggest that they are not feeling quite as bad about the loss as their friend is, which I think is an interesting possibility.
Have you considered using identical twins?
I'll take 2 minutes to finish the whole talk, and then you can all fire your questions at me. Okay, so there's some other groups that we could potentially use. People who are notoriously have difficulties in the empathy domain. There are all sorts of questions about gender and age and profession that we could ask. I'm especially interested, of course, in investigating professions for whom empathy is something that you formally train for. But I can see some technical difficulties, perhaps, in doing something on psychoanalysts or indeed psychotherapists. But I'd welcome anyone who'd like to get involved in a study of this nature. There are some functional imaging findings that we'd very much like to do. You need to compare controls in control groups in order to do that. But playing versus viewing are interesting comparisons, or the person who chooses and the person who's punished, comparing reward versus punishment trials, for example. All of this could potentially be very interesting. So, I mean, I think, I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you that there's a sort of corner of emotion research here, which is clearly not investigated very much at all, but potentially bears on a lot of issues that are important for, the sort of everyday real-world experience of human beings. And as a scientist, of course, I very much like getting in there early before the field's been mopped up by other people and starting to investigate these difficult questions. So I'm really delighted to have had the opportunity to be able to tackle what I think are really a potentially interesting set of research questions. But of course, it also means that we have to do a lot more research, but that's another matter. So on that note, I will finish. Thank you very much.
You want to take some questions?
I will do.
Go ahead.
I have the worrying feeling that there's going to be an awful lot of these after. Do you want to run the discussion, or shall I just point to it? I'll keep pointing until there are no more hands.
But you avoided my
A question and a comment. The question is, what were the size of the groups that you were working with?
I think I showed group size over there. Our first control group is the smallest. I think it's 16, because their effects were pretty reliable and it's not quite as novel. We collected much larger groups in the low to mid-20s for the other, for the more controversial versions. So, but we haven't looked at individual differences between that, which is the interesting question. I mean, there are all sorts of variables that we consider. Sorry.
And the comment is that it seems to me where you ended up on the Schadenfreude concept as being the explanation, that in a way that has potentially profound implications in terms of really what empathy is in a human being and how people behave toward one another. And having said that, the question becomes, is there any neuroscientific findings in terms of the areas of the brain that are activated when someone is experiencing Schadenfreude?
What a good question. I mean, I'm not an authority in all of this, and I don't know if David in the corner knows anything more. Every sort of functional imaging or other neuroscience study that I've seen on empathy always focuses, as I said in the talk, on these simple things. Pain is the obvious example. Those, for example, mirror neuron findings, which are very interesting, but does the same brain area, F5 I think it is, activate when a monkey picks up a peanut as when somebody else picks up a peanut for them. And I'm very interested in the picking up of peanuts, but it doesn't quite capture the Schadenfreude concept, I think. So I don't think anyone's done it. And they haven't done it because, of course, scientists like to tackle simple, tractable problems. I didn't think I was studying Schadenfreude here. I've just stumbled onto it by mistake.
Bill.
So yes, thank you.
I think I had a similar idea about Schadenfreude, but I think that that might be hard to measure, but it might come from an element of competitiveness, which you could expect among intimate friends, along with the empathy. so that the final results, the two pairs look very different from that point of view. The first one looked much more amusingly in touch than the second pair, which looked more serious. And just for whatever it's worth, the first pair in your first picture, they were even in the same position, which a lot of research in the 70s on body movement during psychotherapy was used as a measure of empathy. But the point is, you could measure competitiveness, I think, much more easily than you could measure, getting at somebody's pleasure in pain. And that might be a possible route. And just one other point. Unfortunately, I can't give you a reference, but there were experiments in which people had monkeys perform tests in which an observer monkey received the punishment for the failure in the test. And I cannot remember either where or when it was. It probably was in some place like science. And so that's really like the model you're suggesting, which could be very interesting as an influence on learning.
I think I'd very much like to follow that up. I don't know whether the monkey research was about how probabilistic the learning was. It would be very interesting to see if there's a primate version.
Well, the being too smart for your own good is the competitiveness.
I'm sorry?
The idea of being too smart for your own good is the competitiveness. Is you want to do better, and you do exactly the opposite of what the other person did, and the test allows you to fail in that situation.
Or you could be also competitive while you are no longer the observer and imagining the pleasure of the person at your failure. You see? So it's a double level of empathy, or let's say double-barreled empathy. And we can't assume that empathy is an emotion that can stand in isolation.
Well, all we have on our participants are, firstly, a standard that we wanted to use the same tools as other people, and there's a standard friendship questionnaire which sort of measures how good are the two of you as friends. As you can imagine from those sort of tick box questionnaires, they don't quite capture all of the more interesting and sophisticated aspects of an interaction. And we also have an empathy questionnaire which says, how empathic are you? A whole series of questions. So I don't know quite what we'll get out of it, but there are a whole range of individual differences that I think would potentially be very interesting. So thanks for those suggestions.
Yeah, I have a question on the data, on the skin, on the registration of the skin, that when the player lost, that I don't know if I understood, that the observer registered a higher level of reaction on the skin. Did I get that wrong?
Thinking about it.
That would have been interesting if it were true. But if I can go back to that, SCR finding, where are we? It's this one over here. So this is the player. Well, let's go to this condition, which is the one we care. This is obviously the same player twice. This is the observer's skin conductance responses, and this is the observer when they're now a player. But this is the person who's been a blind observer in the first phase. So it seemed to us that phase 2 was higher pretty much regardless of that. I don't know if that's because people more like to be alone, but then that was true also of this person who was alone all the time. That doesn't quite answer your question.
Yeah.
Well, I
was wondering the comparison that when the player lost, what was the difference in the skin conductance between the player and the observer?
Well, those kinds of trial-by-trial observations are possible to do, but you'll have to take my word for it on how complicated it is to try to match the behavioral performance to the skin conductance of the observer. It's one mouse click for us to do one of these, and a lot more to kind of go through it trial by trial. But yes, we could do it.
The reason I'm asking the question is really the question about whether or not the actual experience is more potent or the imagined empathic experience is more potent. And the reason I ask it is that anecdotally, as an analyst, I've noticed that in families where there was physical abuse, that it seems sometimes to have impacted more on the observer than the one who experienced it concretely. And so that's sort of what I was interested in terms of the question.
Well, it's manageable for us. We don't have the data now, but in principle, we could extract it from our findings. And that would be easier in that we could do that for all individuals. The individual differences work that people have been suggesting, which is fascinating, is much trickier to do because it's a question of which variable predicts performance, and that's statistically a harder task for us.
Roger? Yeah, this is also a skin conductance question. But when you look the word empathy up in most good English dictionaries, the first definition will usually be something about imaginative projection into the emotional life of the other. Then as you work your way down, there's almost always something there, maybe third or fourth entry, about a deep and involuntary muscular imitation that the observer is in a very real sense experiencing the muscular reactions of the observer. And what's the relationship when you're measuring skin conductivity? I mean, is that in effect what's being measured, or is that a more superficial measurement of this sort of deep bodily response, sort of German notion of Einfühlung, where you are completely merged with the body of the person you're observing?
Well, I mean, the concrete example is we try to make sure that people don't move their skin conductance hands very much at all, because it really interferes with the signal if people move around. But as I understand the literature on, say, the mirror neuron literature, it suggests that empathy begins from imitation of the actions of others and then potentially extends beyond it. Although from a psychoanalytic perspective, you might see that the action part might be developing a little bit later than the potential for some other empathic interactions of an emotional sort. But there is a literature, people have mentioned it here earlier today, on mirroring of actions between observer and first. We only capture the sort of facial expressions of our participants. I don't have anything more than that. Although you could see it was clear that one of the two pairs in that slide seemed to be physically more joined up with each other than the others. But of course, they were the Schadenfreude group. She might have been looking like her friend, but she's the one who laughed when her friend lost money. Although she tapped her on the shoulder to console her afterwards.
I'm wondering about the learner in the condition that you were thinking about doing to test the idea of mislabeling the emotions. So the learner now, the consequences of the first player, and the consequences are going to the observer. Right? So what happens to the first player's performance? Would you actually expect them to mislabel because they're getting a similar kind of laughing, positive experience with the negative consequence going to the observer, and so you get the decrement for the first player when they play it a second time. Is that what you predict, or?
So the question is, will the player be worse if they are not receiving the rewards?
That would be a prediction, right? If you're correct about what the observer.
I think mechanically, it's quite a difficult one to imagine, because at the moment, although you know that the reward, you would know that the reward was going to the other person, but you would still hear the sound, and you would know whether you'd won your friend money or not, I suppose. And we also know that people do all right on the gambling task in a sort of monopoly money version of the game, in which there's no concrete financial reward for them. They're just playing to win more nothingness, more facsimile money. And so it would be very hard for the player not to feel that they shouldn't notice the emotional consequences. That would be very hard to factor that out. But it's possible they might.
But compared to when we play again, and now they're getting the rewards themselves, you'd expect them to at least be worse than they would be.
I would certainly expect them to be worse. It would be hard for me to predict how much worse, but then I'm very bad at predicting. I didn't think that these people would be catastrophic on this time when I designed the experiment.
Dolly?
I was just going to add to, regarding mirror neurons, there's a psychoanalyst who did a symposium on mirror neurons and empathy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Jacoboni and I forget the other Italian researcher spoke particularly to the relationship of mirror neurons to empathy, and that kind of response that you were describing.
We plan to invite Galesa from Turnbull to come. But David.
Oliver, thank you for an extraordinary talk and wonderful work. The breadth of it and your perspective as well as knowledge is really something, and stepping into this new area at the convergence of emotion and cognition and social interactions, and with the complexity is something that is not easy, and it's very easy to second guess and to think of other controlled conditions after the fact, but to venture into this area and to flesh it out the way you're fleshing it out is really going to be important. And I'm excited to think ahead when you start to do the functional imaging, because in this case, the functional imaging can do more, I think, than just provide a neural correlate. It can help you test some of these competing hypotheses that you have about what some of the mechanisms are that may account for these behavioral differences. And in particular, I sort of like not the last theory, but your second to last theory, where you're talking about the ability of the person to test their own hypotheses as they generate them. You're being in the driver's seat versus not being in the driver's seat, the whole issue of statistical prediction, and then direct feedback. And as you know, the cingulate is involved in error monitoring, and the whole orbitofrontal cingulate system is sort of a feedback and feed-forward loop that projects out and then gets feedback and self-corrects and modifies itself. And doing that oneself versus where you have that whole beginning phase versus just watching the other person do it, where you don't have the whole pre-action phase is a big difference. And then in terms of the empathy component too, I'm sure you're aware of the theory of mind experiments of Chris Frith and others, and some of the experiments where the difference between playing a game against or watching something when you are told that a computer is generating it versus another person, and you really engage the dorsal-medial prefrontal cortex and the superior temporal sulcus when you think another person is doing it, and so the ability to then have in phase one observing a computer do it rather than the friend, and still then having all of the same feedback and all of the, or not feedback, but the same observational learning, but it's not a person, it's not your friend. Those sorts of things, I think, will be exciting to start to tease apart these findings.
Thanks very much for those comments and for those suggestions. Some of them I really hadn't thought of. I mean, it's certainly clear that this is sort of a whole new world here that we've stumbled onto, and the ideas come thick and fast, which is always a very good sign, as you say, for science, I think.
So I was thinking about the issue of agency, sort of building on what a couple of people have talked about and what you were talking about, and it made me think of watching television. And that when you're watching television or a movie, you're having emotional reactions to something that you're not actually participating in. And that there's some thing like what you were talking about that's going on where you're having emotional reactions, but they're following something that you didn't cause. There's going to be different neural activity. I mean, the only thing I can think of that relates to that empirically that I know of is that if an animal receives an injection of cocaine that they didn't do anything to earn, there's different neural changes that happen in the brain, and if the animal pressed a lever to get the cocaine. So that the experience of watching something but not having the opportunity to do something seems to be a very important aspect, like you're bringing up. And that, in a weird way, it made me have my first positive thought about video games. You know, because video games are there's more agency involved than just watching television. I mean, I have no idea if any of that is relevant. But in any case, there's the whole idea of imagination, imagining something and then putting it into practice is an important thing about being an actualized person. You know, and that's so much of the issues in psychoanalysis is to what extent can you take action on your wishes, and to what extent are you inhibiting yourself?
I'd like to say something with regard to what Bill brought up again, which is to raise the question of the relationship between empathy and a particular relationship. I mean, the experiment raises the question whether you're best testing empathy with friends than you would be, perhaps, between two strangers. It'd be interesting if you had a computer, too, because then you could ask, well, now what am I thinking about as empathy? You know, I mean, but it would be interesting to see how it compares, how friends compare with strangers. And one of the reasons why I raise this is because a friend of mine, Peter Wolf, made an observation which has never left my mind in the office while I'm treating people. He did a long longitudinal observation on hospitalized twins, a pair of hospitalized twins, who they've been foundlings or something like that, so they were really raised in a hospital. And he observed that each twin could very easily put up with the nurse, their favorite nurse. They had a favorite nurse. If that favorite nurse was taking care of anybody else in the room, it was all right. But if that favorite nurse was taking care of their sibling, it enraged them. So it really raised that image has never left my mind. It seems like something very, very basic, you know. And so I think the point was made that you have a relationship here. You don't just have two persons who know each other well. You know what I mean?
Jonathan, you had the question.
Can I just quickly respond to that? Because when we first designed the research, we were faced with what seemed to us like a flip of the coin choice. You know, friends or people who aren't friendly. And we were hoping, of course, to see these huge gains because of empathy. And we chose friends because we thought they would be more empathic. I mean, this worrying scenario, which had we chosen acquaintances, we might not have got this wonderful effect. So it was a lucky choice.
David.
Jonathan, sorry. Well, I too wanted to thank you. It's just such a beautifully clear presentation. It was just beautiful to listen to. And I think the things that interest me in a way might be the things that interest you the least. But let me just say, I'm going to try and interest you. I mean, first I want to just say the place I disagreed with you the most was in your passing remarks about the philosophers. And in particular about Plato, where but I think it becomes an important point because I think Plato...
Was I factually incorrect?
I think you were factually incorrect. I do not think there's a single passage of Plato. I'll be delighted, but I actually don't think there's a single passage in Plato that supports what you say about it. All of reason is very emotive for him, and it's very erotic. We are erotic creatures, especially in our quest for truth. And here, you know, in the second frame I want to...
Can I say, was I wrong about Immanuel Kant as well?
You're wrong about Descartes as well. We'll talk about that. Okay. I mean, we'll talk about it. I want to get to the point that I think is more of interest to you, which is then you started to frame it with the Casablanca image in the story, and there's a question. I mean, it's clear that empathy enters there, but there's something else that I think enters as well, and it's related to the earlier Plato point, which is, it seems to me there's an argument that what the Humphrey Bogart character is moved by is some kind of erotic commitment to an ideal. So in fact, he's able to, whatever empathy he is, he may be empathizing with his lover, empathizing with the other guy, empathizing with all sorts of people, but that phrase you quote, he's basically saying, look, what we're feeling is we're just three people. And I don't think he's saying it's because I'm empathizing with the whole human race. It's because I'm committed to, I see something that's right. It's the right thing to do, and because of that, I'm going to trump what I want, and I'm also going to trump a lot of empathic feelings. So there's a question of like where does that kind of love of truth or an ideal or something get in here? And now we get to your particular experiment, and about this I've really got nothing to say, but something was just crossing my mind about the observer, which is when you're trying to figure out a game, it seems to me you can be trying, and nevertheless, your your commitment, some of the time could be to winning, and another part of the time could be to just figuring it out. What the hell is going on in this game? And trying to do the latter might actually get in the way of you winning. Because you're just trying to get your higher functions going because you want to know the truth. And the observer has sort of had a time to sort of watch this other person doing their thing, and that person, I mean, arguably is clearly just trying to win. But this other person, now in the second time, may well be saying, well, what was going on that first time, and what was going on, and how does this game work, and what's the experimenter trying to figure out? And that might actually get in the way of doing well, of winning.
I was left trying to think of what experiment I would design, what control condition I would design that would tackle that. But
I leave that to
Paul, and then
I have one experimental suggestion and then perhaps a slightly different interpretation.
Well, I certainly have to listen to a man who came up with the third experiment before I showed it to you, so I'm all ears.
Well, as far as the experimental suggestion is concerned, it seems to me that in some sense you've got two hypotheses on the table. One is the Schadenfreude, the other is a kind of uncoupling, a kind of almost Hell's-Heim type experiment, if you remember those. So presumably you could simply arrange it that during the initial phase when the observer is merely watching, they get half the rewards.
Half. Or some fraction.
Or some fraction. Now under those circumstances, if it's just a question of Schadenfreude, then the Schadenfreude should be blocked and they should do perfectly well when it comes to phase 2. On the other hand, if in some sense it's a question of having your emotional system activated, it would be uncoupled from actual contingencies with respect to you, then you'll get a different result, it seems to me. Now, let's suppose that it turns out it looks as if it's Schadenfreude. You could still go along with a slightly different interpretation. You could say it's not that the observer feels good when they see their friend suffer, but it's almost a Bob Geldof effect. It's compassion fatigue. So you put them in this situation where repeatedly they're empathizing with their friend, and then they have to turn on this same system again when it comes to their own case. So maybe the slower learning is because in some sense you switched off this crucial mechanism by virtue of that's a different explanation from the Schadenfreude. I can't think of how to test between them, but it is a different explanation.
I'm just thinking of the other accounts, because I mean, in the blind observer condition, you have, I suppose, you run the risk of the same amount of compassion fatigue, in that you've just been watching the same amount of your friend experience the same amount of loss as in the regular one, but obviously there's a big behavioural difference between the two. So does that? Would that shed light on that, or is that not?
I must admit, I'm having trouble figuring out how to separate the compassion fatigue from Schadenfreude, because whenever you're giving the observer emotional information, they can either construe it in terms of delight in their friend's loss, or gosh, I have to emphasize yet again. So I can't separate it.
But I do like the idea of sharing the rewards equally, or allowing them a greater investment, the observer, seems to me an interesting...
But they wouldn't be making the choices, and so under those circumstances, it's really crucial that you make choices. Then they would be equally impaired in those circumstances. Whereas the Schadenfreude explanation is a word they should jump up and improve with that.
Sure.
So, yeah,
Mike is the last question, then we go for lunch.
To what extent was the observer, what was the observer's expectations of a disclosure of his or her results when the observer actually performed the task after subject death?
Sorry, I just got to give that to me again.
In other words, did they expect that they would be rated and that whether or not they did better or worse would be disclosed to their friend or to the tester?
That's interesting. First, something that's not the answer to that, which is that we didn't tell the players either of the two people that the observer was going to be tested a second time. We didn't tell them about phase 2 when they were doing phase 1.
Okay.
And neither group have any disclosure of their performances to anybody.
Okay, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking about, and it relates to the fact that the blind observer performed at least equally to the original subject. And the blind observer really wasn't into the game, it was pure emotional. So and what I'm really getting down to is a fourth or perhaps a fifth explanation. Can we have a level of performance anxiety here, whereby the observer, because of competition, the competitive instinct, which I really believe is related but separate from Schadenfreude, in effect found more pressure on them than the original test, especially when they had at least seen how the game is paid, so that their own level of intellect was somehow involved.
Okay, so this group over here, the observer feels that they have to do better than the player because, after all, you've seen it all.
Exactly.
Whereas in this condition, there's no requirement whatsoever. In fact, they outperform them.
Yeah,
they're better
exactly.
than naive.
Right.
So that's an interesting idea. Thank
Okay,
you very much.
you can ask him, he will be around for the rest of the day.